Hello everyone, Dr. Lisa here again. This is segment 16 in U.S. History 1, the Era of Reconstruction. This is our final topic for this course. Reconstruction is the era that follows after the Civil War. As it is named, the idea was to reconstruct the nation into something new, something stronger, something that could survive the future. If you think about it, the United States has lasted a good deal of time since then. Reconstruction ended in 1877, so you would assume that Reconstruction was successful. And in most ways, it was not. In fact, the Civil War, which was the costliest war in American history, claiming nearly 1 million lives if you count the number of soldiers from the North and the South that fought, not to mention the untold numbers of civilians that died from all sorts of things like disease, starvation, and also attacks and conflict throughout the nation. But in the end, Reconstruction was designed to figure out a way to reconcile the North and the South, and that's where we have a problem. In the North, the abolitionist movement to end slavery was a good starting place, but after the death of Lincoln, what we see is that the Northern congressmen, mostly now radical Republicans who thought Lincoln was actually too soft on the Southerners, seek to punish the South for these years of war, death, and destruction, and the great cost that they had inflicted on the nation. So instead of making sure that the former slaves, now called freedmen, were well situated to integrate into American society, they began to try to punish the Southerners instead. So the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, the 14th Amendment, which granted civil rights to all Americans, including the former slaves, and then of course the 15th Amendment, which granted the right to vote to these freedmen, were great starting places legally. But the problem was with enforcement of these rules. President Johnson, who took over for Lincoln when he was assassinated, and then President Ulysses S. Grant, who was in charge for 8 years during the bulk of the Reconstruction era, used the Army to enforce the rules. And while this was a normal sort of place to start in the aftermath of a war, there was no real transition planned. So one of the problems is that the Southerners chafed under the rule of the North and the enforcement of the rules by the Army, and began to subvert the law however they could. This is the birth era of the groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the Knights of the White Camellia, and so resistance to the Northern laws began even before the Army left. And while those groups were combated by the Army early on, eventually the Army would leave. And the gains that African Americans made in the aftermath of the Civil War during Reconstruction, where the first African American congressmen were elected and local leaders were elected as well, would be set backwards again when the Army did finally leave in 1877. So in many ways the Reconstruction era was a failure. After the Army left in 1877, the South reverted back in many ways to what it had been before the Civil War, a white-governed Southern society that was built on segregation rather than slavery. So the idea of segregation and the idea of limiting the access to things like education and freedoms guaranteed by the Constitution became something that was normal in many of the Southern states. That isn't to say that every single person in the South wanted this, but much of the Southern leadership were the same people who had owned slaves or the children of those people who had owned slaves before the Civil War. So it was a very hard thing to overcome, and it took a long time. Like our discussion on slavery itself, what we see is the long-term effects of this, and I believe, like I said before, we still see the effects of this today. So as you think about Reconstruction, it is a sad story in many ways. Legally, things change, but in many ways, the civil rights that were guaranteed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were never fully enforced. And in fact, it took almost 100 years, all the way up until the 1960s, when Dr. King and other civil rights leaders pushed for true reform, for many of these things to actually change. So as you move through the series of pages and readings on Reconstruction, think about those things. Pay particular attention to the idea of sharecropping and how that kept African Americans in an economic condition of near servitude. And I look forward again to hearing what you guys have to say and thinking about these things in discussion. All right, that's it for now. I look forward to speaking with all of you this week, hopefully. Talk to you soon.